I am an historian, and my specialty is urban history, so while everything I'm going to say has implications for the future, it's because we need to understand how we got here and how change happens if we're going to go be agents of change. So I'm still one of those people that's talking about the historical part, and I think the next two speakers will be prognosticating more than I will. I have two topics that I want to talk about today. One is to describe briefly one of the periods of crisis that produced transformation in the New York metropolitan region. I'm going to be focusing particularly on transportation. The title of the talk is There's No Getting Around It. I think arguably, as you'll see, the issue is getting through it and within it as much as getting around it. But transportation is an important issue for understanding environmental transformations. So I'm going to talk about one of those important transition years. And then secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the way the term crisis or the sense of crisis has been used and misused in the policy arena, something for us to keep in mind as we move forward. So, first of all, this big transformational period that I'm going to talk about is the period between World War I and World War II. There's this question that we really need to understand if we're going to talk about environmental transformations of the metropolitan area, of how cities went from being, in the 1920s, overcrowded, congested, and densely settled, to 50 years later, abandoned, sprawling, and dispersed. And that's an important environmental transformation for us to understand if we're going to make movements towards increased sustainability in the 21st century. Now, I will point out here that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to bounce back and forth, somewhat about New York and somewhat about a national story, because this is one of those instances where New York is, in some ways, an exception. Because yes, there was decentralization in the New York area, there was suburbanization, there was what I think is incorrectly oversimplified as white flight, and you'll see why I think that's a problematic oversimplification. And yes, by the 1970s, there was a point at which it was uncertain what the future of the center of New York would be. Even as the metropolitan area was doing just fine, the city itself was in real trouble. But not the same kind of trouble that many, many other American cities faced. And the poster child for that kind of decentralization and central city abandonment are places like Detroit or Newark or St. Louis or Cleveland, places where the center really hasn't come back and we're not sure if it's going to be able to come back. But that, and you might be thinking those places are places traditionally described as the Rust Belt. I think also the Rust Belt, Sun Belt notion is also an oversimplification we should avoid. Instead, what I really want to talk about is the set of policy structures that encouraged people to move away from the center of cities and to the edge or away from centralized cities to relatively unpopulated areas. We'll see what I mean in a minute. But so it's sprawl within a metropolitan area and sprawl across the United States, both of which I want to address here. Before I do that, though, it's important to consider what these policies were intended to address or where they came from. So let's start with the 1920s congested city for a minute before we then address both housing and transportation policies that disperse the population across the countryside and across the country. What I want to focus on here, since the premise of this conference is that there are problems that reach a crisis point, and from that crisis point we sometimes move towards resolution. And I think therefore let's spend a minute to understand what the crisis was. And in this case, the crisis of the 1920s was described in the media at the time as congestion. And it meant more things than it does now. When people talk about congestion now, they're almost always talking about traffic congestion. But the traffic congestion that people were talking about in the 1920s was, yes, it was congestion on the streets, but even that was more than just vehicular traffic congestion. and I'll say something about that in just a moment. But it was also congestion referring to the overcrowded so-called slums of, for example, the Lower East Side, where you had, by some accounts, the most densely populated place on the globe, on the Lower East Side, in terms of numbers of people living in per square mile. I've heard that said a number of times. I've never, to my knowledge, some of the relatively dense cities in parts of Asia weren't really very well measured at the time, so I don't know that it's true, but it may very well be. At any rate, let's talk about the streets for a minute. I think the story of overcrowded housing and tenements is one that is fairly well known. And if you need a visceral example of that, get a tour of the Lakeside Tenement Museum. But the congestion on the streets, this is an era in which the automobile was in the process of being adopted by many Americans. A Model T cost, as a percentage of family income, less than cars do now. It was at its most affordable moment was in the 1920s in terms of the relationship of what a typical car costs to the average family income. But we still had in New York on 9 of the 11 avenues there were still elevated trains. There was two-way traffic on every street. There were no rules about where you could or could not park. Most streets did not have any traffic lights. I hope you're getting a picture of the chaos that was the street. It was, so you had people parking wherever they wanted, people crossing wherever they wanted. The elevated train platforms being supported by upright pillars. It was a traffic disaster. There were estimates at the time, and this is this important thing about historians adjusting their dollar figures. There were estimates at the time that the New York City economy was losing about $1 million a day because of the traffic congestion on the streets and on the sidewalks. That sounds like it probably was a lot of money then, but if you do the math in the right kind of way, which is not adjusting in this case for the consumer price index, but if you adjust it for the size of the economy, because this was a question of how much it was costing the economy,